meeting of our um, College of Humanities and Social Sciences, and here in UP Mindanao. We are honored to have you all here today, especially to our guest speaker and students, participants, and viewers from the Zoom. And thank you for having with us today. We are living in a different time. From the past, as individuals, we have different ways to cope and move on. But as individuals, we may process different ways uh, to move on. However, in the context of a large scale historical conflicts as a society, we must respond together to this kind of challenges. How do we respond to these challenges? Is a big question. So this event, I hope, will help you answer these questions. For example, how do we deal with the past conflicts that we have affected as a society, and how do we address the issues of accountability, land rights, and human rights for the Muslim communities? How do we relate with the proposed federalism that may change the political landscape? There are some These are some of the big questions that we hope to explore in this event. So we invite you to share your thoughts and insights and to stay until the end of this activity. I hope you will enjoy and share your um, insights, and thank you for joining us today. This event is initiated by the Department of Social Sciences and Mindanao Study Center Forum Discussion. Once again, I welcome all of you in this event. Thank you and enjoy the activities ahead. Good morning.
Okay, so thank you po, Assistant Prof. Um, so acknowledging the presence of everyone here, sa ating speaker, sa ating mga reactors, sa ating mga students, faculty from the Department of Social Sciences, visitors, and of course, we are also acknowledging mga tao na nasa loob ng Zoom. So let's have a great time here to know more and to delve more with regards to the topic. So just a little housekeeping before we get started. If may mga tanong, please type them to the Zoom box and we'll bring them up. Tapos next, magkakaroon tayo ng mga reactors and before the talk. So without further ado, we will turn the time now for our speaker. So our presenter, our lecturer for today is our very own Dr. Jason Lamchek. So first, let's have a talk about kung sino ba siya. So Dr. Jason Lamchek is a Filipino human rights lawyer and research fellow at the Deakin University Law School in Melbourne, Australia. So Dr. Lamchek's research explores human rights in their political, historical, and international context, often incorporating critical perspectives on law and justice. So he also explores a variety of themes on human rights and security with a focus on counterterrorism in the Philippines and as well as in Indonesia, and material inequality. So more recently, Dr. Lamchek's scholarship tackles science as a human right and human rights issues of technology with a focus on artificial intelligence and cybersecurity. So, hindi natin papahintayin pa. So, sir.
Sige ba umupo na lang ako? Okay lang. Sige. Sige, bahala na. Sometimes I'll stand up, sometimes I'll sit down. Salamat for being here, no? Aga-aga. Tapos le-lecturean kayo on possibly such a niche topic. So yeah, so thanks, I appreciate it. So ito yung topic ko ngayon, transitional justice in the Bangsamoro and Federalism. Shall we deal with the past or move forward? So siguro explain ko a little bit yung title. Yeah? The next slide. Okay. Siguro doon sa title na yon, you can see na dalawang bagay yung discuss ko, no? So yung federalism, more or less, you know that, right? Yung transitional justice, siguro yun yung medyo technical term na kailangan siguro natin unpack, no? So possibly doon sa expression of transitional justice, ang mas kailangan explain yung transitional. Kasi we have some idea of what justice is, right? Pero why do you say transitional justice then? No? So yung term na transitional justice implies that there must be some kind of transition or transitional stage that society is undergoing, right? So it's coming from somewhere and going towards somewhere else, which is different from what came before. Tapos so that transition could mean it's a transition from, originally it meant it was a transition from military dictatorship to something more democratic, a democratic regime. So actually, original transitional justice started in the 1980s in Latin America. No? So sa Latin America, just like yung experience sa Pilipinas in 1986, no? They had military dictatorships. And then, napatalsik nila yung dictator nila, they installed something more democratic. No? Okay, so they thought that at that stage, they had the transition from military dictatorship to democracy. And within this stage, it is possible to address justice issues that were not possible to address before the transition. Now, so actually, transitional justice started from the human rights movement. No? So ang mga nagpaumpisa nito, mga human rights activists. So during military dictatorship, human rights activists, all they can do really is to name and shame yung military dictatorship. They can't really use the justice system, di ba? To pursue yung mga cases of torture, illegal detention and all that kasi the courts were controlled by the military dictatorship. So you can imagine now. No? So transitional justice means a society is undergoing a transition, and within this transition, it's possible to address justice issues that were not possible to address before that. Tapos later on, the transition was expanded to also mean a transition from inter-ethnic conflict to something more peaceful, right? So hindi na lang military dictatorship, anything no? That involves conflict, especially inter-ethnic conflict. And then if you reach a stage where it's possible to have like a peaceful settlement of that conflict, then you can say that society is undergoing a transition. And therefore, you can also have transitional justice. Okay. So just to make it really crystal clear, no? Transitional justice is a specific conception of what justice is and what the transition is. Kasi if you think about it, there are other theories of change that also assume that societies undergo like qualitative change. Na kunyari, in Marxism, no, Marxists think of history as a transition from one mode of production to another, right? And in fact, there's a theory within Marxism that democracy, kunyari, the National Democrats, no, they think of democracy as a transition to socialism, right? So there's also a conception of transitions, no? Pero yung changes na pinopropose ng mga Marxists is quite different, no? From the reforms that transitional justice advocates advocate, no? So transitional justice advocates, they tend to think of reforms as being legal reforms or institutional reforms, no? And I'll explain a bit later on. So the important thing to point out is that nung nagkaroon ng peace process na nag-conclude na nga no, sa peace agreement. Nagkaisa na yung MILF at saka yung Philippine government that the conflict will have to stop, right? Transitional justice professionals thought, oh, the Philippines is undergoing a transition. No? And therefore, we should use no, yung resources ng at saka discourse ng transitional justice para ma-address natin yung mga justice issues ng mga Moro at saka ng mga Lumad na were not possible to address before the peace agreement was concluded. No? So the thing to point out is that yung peace agreement contained provisions about transitional justice, right? So just a few key events na to situate na where ano ba yung mga bakit ganito yung pagkasulat ng study. Now, by the way, I would like to say na yung talk ko ngayon nakabase siya sa isang study which is already published some time ago. And I'm very glad someone is interested for me to present on that. No, this is my first time to present that study actually anywhere, and I'm really happy that it's in Mindanao. I'm gonna be doing it in Mindanao. No? Yeah. Okay. So ito yung mga events, no? Key events. No? So 2014 na-conclude yung peace agreement, no? Tawag doon yung framework agreement on the Bangsamoro. So panahon pa yan ni Pinoy, right? And then 2015 the Mama Sapano clash happened, right? And that delayed yung passage ng law which was supposed to give the approval to the peace process ng Congress natin. Ang tawag pa noon yung Bangsamoro Basic Law, right? And then in 2016, we elected Duterte, right? And Duterte ran partly on the platform that he will solve the Moro conflict through federalism, right? So iba yung solution niya, di ba? So Pinoy had the peace agreement, right? BBL couldn't pass Congress, and here comes Duterte. The people elected him, no? Partly on the promise that he will institute federalism. But so, of course, we know hindi natuloy yun. No? But anyway, no? 2017, nagkaroon ng fighting sa Marawi, right? Leading to the imposition of martial law, right? And then Duterte signs an EO which constituted this constitutional commission, no? That recommended changes in the constitution to convert us to a federal government. So confusing, no? So in effect, itong timeline na ito is giving you a picture of if people were from outside the Philippines, or kahit within the Philippines, if they were interested in transitional justice, they'd be confused like, so is the Philippines really undergoing a transition? No? What kind of transition is it? Is it transition to peace? No? Eh bakit may martial law sa Mindanao? No? So what kind of opportunities are possible na to address justice issues that couldn't be addressed before transition? And then in 2018, Duterte approved BOL, di ba? Bangsamoro Organic Law establishing BARM. No? So when I started this study, by the way, this is a co-written study with my colleague from the National University of Singapore, si George Radix. No? So when we started this study, ang main concern namin is how to make sense of it all. No? Is the Philippines really undergoing a transition? Transition to what? No? And what kind of justice is possible during this transition? So next slide. Okay, so doon sa title, sabi ko, should we deal with the past or move forward? No? So I was referring to two things. No? Yung dealing with the past, yun actually yung title ng framework on transitional justice na pinagkaisahan ng MILF at yung government dun sa peace agreement nila. No? So yung transitional justice framework, ang tawag nila dun, dealing with the past framework. I will talk more about it later on. Okay? Tapos, essentially, if I can distill it, ang konsepto ng justice dito is accountability, no, for past atrocities, no, against the Moros and the Lumads. So, for example, they say we have to have reparations for existing victims, no, ng atrocities na ito. All right. And this actually constituted part of a package of deals with the MILF, which was concluded under the Pinoy administration. And as we know, that agreement was specially crafted, carefully crafted by our very best lawyers, no, including now Justice Leonen, who sits in the Supreme Court, to be consistent with the 1987 Constitution. So yun yung dealing with the past na tinutukoy ko sa title. No? Na yung moving forward naman, it has to do with a different kind of imagination of na how to achieve justice. No? Okay? So una-una, title pa lang, no? Move forward. Ibig sabihin, move on, no? Let's move on. Let's forget about the past. Let's think about the future instead of dwelling on the past, right? Tapos, so essentially, ang conception ng justice dito is not really accountability for past atrocities, but let's create opportunities for economic development. So it's looking to the future, right? No? And so ang forma nito, and I will say, ito yung argument ko sa paper is yung federalism proposal. No? So moving forward is embodied by yung federalism proposal ni Duterte. No? So supposedly it's a new, more ambitious deal. More ambitious than the peace talks. More ambitious than the peace agreement. No? For all regions, no? Including Moros outside the MILF area. MILF area. So for example, this appealed to the MNLF, right? They will have their own region. No? It was offered by Duterte, and it implied that we will have to change the constitution for this. Okay. So kita nyo yung contrast between those two frameworks now. So okay. So what did I actually do in this study? No? So I asked three things, no? So about transitional justice, yung una, paano ba inimagine yung transitional justice sa peace agreement? No? And to answer that question, we look at the work of the Transitional Justice and Reconciliation Commission, which I will talk about later. No? This was created by the peace agreement. No? And it was actually implemented even before BOL was approved. Okay, I'll explain it later. Tapos, pangalawa, okay, so this is how it was imagined in the peace agreement. How could it be improved? No, if it could be improved. No? So, ano yung limits noon? So, that's another question I asked. No? So, to help me think about this question, I reflected on what happened in Marawi. Kasi, so I will provide something like a case study dito sa talk ko na Marawi is a case in which, no, meron pa ring land grabbing, no, na ang sabi ng mga Moro at saka ng gobyerno was a root cause of the conflict, no, sa Mindanao. Okay? And this land grabbing problem will not be resolved, no, through the transitional justice mechanism, not sufficiently resolved, no, even within the transitional justice framework na ina-advocate sa peace agreement. Tapos pangatlo, I will zero in on federalism. So, what's the impact of federalism on transitional justice? Nasabi ko na nga sa umpisa, it looks like magkaibang framework, no, yung transitional justice at yung federalism. So I will analyze yung mga pro-federalism views na in-express nung mga na-interview namin, nung ginawa namin yung study. Okay, so but before we proceed, no? So I told you about transitional justice, no, as something that started in the 1980s. It was an offshoot of the human rights movement. Later on, transitional justice became a global thing. No? It became a professional field. No? So people were doing transitional justice as a professional practice. No? So they were lawyers, they were political scientists, they were historians, they were all engaged in transitional justice, and they were promoting transitional justice all over the world. No? So they were developing the discourse of transitional justice. Even the UN eventually endorsed a set of principles, no, called the 4 Pillars of Transitional Justice. So right now, ang conventional conception natin ng transitional justice revolves around 4 things. No? Tinatawag nilang 4 pillars. No? Dito tayo muna sa red. Dun sa red part. No? Yung conventional transitional justice. Criminal prosecutions. No? truth commissions, reparations, and institutional reform. So if you talk to a transitional justice professional, no, that's what they mean by transitional justice. No? These four things. No? When you are in a transition, then you need these four things. No? To be able to address yung mga justice issues which couldn't be addressed before. No? And these are big things, these big asks. Ito, no? Kunyari sa Philippines, di ba? Noong 1986, we got rid of a dictatorship. Ang daming mga human rights violations na kinumit, but we never had the Truth Commission. No? We never had the formal process, unlike, for example, in South Africa after apartheid, in which they really, talked to people and said, what kind of human rights violations did you experience? No? And they did not have an opportunity to confront yung mga violators nila. No? So that's why we hear about people like, for example, former chair of the Human Rights Commission, Eta Rosales, who was tortured and raped, no, while she was detained under martial law, but could not get justice, no, from her torture, from her rapist, right? Okay. Criminal prosecution din, marami ring tayong pagkukulang dyan. Under, again, example natin yung after the fall of the Marcos dictatorship, we hardly prosecuted any of these military people whom the victims accused of human rights violations, right? Okay. Kasi understandably, Cory was concerned, no, about keeping the military loyal to the administration because she was besieged by a series of coups, di ba? So if she pushed hard against mga human rights violators within the military, no, she might lose power, no? So there was a concern to balance transitional justice with the stability of our government. Tapos reparations, no? Eventually Pinoy passed the law, no? After many years of lobbying, no, by victims na please give us compensation, no, for the human rights violations we suffered, no. Ayan, naka-score tayo diyan, no. Huli man pero naka-score tayo diyan. Tapos institutional reforms refer to yung measures na implement mo to reform, let's say, the police or the military or the courts to ensure na hindi mauulit yung human rights violations. So that's what it means. So even the UN recognizes these four things are important, no? If you want to achieve justice during the transition, right? Okay. These are big asks already. Malaking kahilingan na ito. Pero scholars, no, alam niyo naman, kami mga scholars, lahat na lang ng pagkukulang nakikita natin. So scholars say actually, okay, these are good, pero may kulang pa yan. No? Kunyari, when yung field ng transitional justice, when it was just starting, no, there were still countries that were emerging from colonialism. No? Would you believe that? No? Kunyari, so they were thinking about, would you consider a transition from colonialism a transition, right? In that case, let's say it's a transition. In that case, these four pillars are not sufficient. No? Kunyari, a lot of the atrocities committed by the former colonial regime has to do with a land dispossession, right? And land dispossession cannot really be addressed through these four four mechanisms. No? Sabi nila, these four mechanisms reflect yung fact na transitional justice was dominated by lawyers, no? This field, no? Kasi ang focus nila, legalist sila, no? They focus on justice in terms of getting it from the legal system, from the courts, no? So, and also they think about rights violations as individual rights violations, no? Civil and political rights. They largely forgot about structural violence, about structural injustices, no? And also economic kinds of injustices, cultural kinds of injustice, gender-based injustices, which we can talk about more later on. They also fail largely to implicate international actors, right? Kunyari, again, referring back to our experience, Marcos committed economic crimes, but not single-handedly, di ba? So he had co-conspirators, the Swiss banks, di ba? So how about them? No? So when we undergo a transition, you don't just address it by making Marcos accountable, but also his international co-conspirators, right? So I mentioned the Swiss kasi later on the Swiss will have a role too, no? Dito sa transition natin sa Bangsamoro. Okay, so some of the things that are not included dun sa 4 pillars, which were clearly, let's say, articulated by yung reparations movement sa to do with the transatlantic slave trade ay, kunyari, right to return. Right? Kasi if you're dispossessed, if you consider that as an injustice, how do you address yung land dispossession? Sabi nila, then you should allow people who were dispossessed to return, di ba? To the land where they were displaced, right? And we will return to this discussion later when we talk about Marawi. No? So right to return, some people experience annihilation of their culture. No? So itong Criminal Prosecution Commission Reparations Institutional Reform, limited yan, kailangan may balik mo rin yung culture, right? So one of the things that they say is dapat meron din kunyari language recuperation. No? Tapos ano
They undertook a massive research over the course of more than a year. And one of our reactors here, si Max, who's involved in the process. She can say more about that process. It's the next slide. They documented these 4 root causes. How did they do that? They interviewed 3,000 people. They interviewed 3,000 individuals having a listening process. From more than 120 Muslim and non-Muslim indigenous and settler communities. So to find out what do you mean by moral, what do you mean by legitimate grievances, what do you mean by that possession? So not only did they talk to people, they engaged experts, they reviewed the academic literature, they reviewed the documentary archives, field studies, and government policies. When I read the report, I was shocked. Kasi essentially, they did the work of a truth commission. Di ba? They did the work of a truth commission. And no one in the room has heard of them. Right? They did such massive work to document itong mga injustices na analyze according to how the MILF and the PH government thought were the root causes of the conflict. So very significant. So they illustrated yung sinasabi ng MILF at ng Philippine government, the root causes ng conflict. Not only they illustrated, they interrelated it. They made an elegant analysis. Ano ba yung connection ng grievances sa human rights violation at saka land dispossession? They showed that actually these 4 root causes were interlapping, interrelated concepts. Okay, balik tayo sa pabalik. Okay, so balik ako. So they illustrated the root causes, extensive documentation, and various kinds of evidence. And then they did something. And dito ako i-eksena. Bilang scholar. Okay yun, dinocument nila. Fantastic. We should all read about it. But they did something which was, they analyzed it in a certain way. so that the recommended solutions would fit the analysis. So what did they do? No? So they reinterpreted the root causes of the moral conflict into three concepts. Okay? Very, very broad concepts. No? Una, violence. Pangalawa, impunity. Pangatlo, neglect. No? Okay. May mga philosopher dito, ayan na, mag-isip na sila. So what's the problem? No? Do this, ano bang problema sa mga concepts na ito? Wala naman, no? Kundi I'll show you that there's something going on here. No? May intellectual work na nangyayari dito. Let's just focus on impunity. Okay, this is a three concepts ito. Impunity. So ang theory ng Transitional Justice and Reconciliation Commission is that to achieve peace, which is what yun yung end goal ng transition, right? We want to move from inter-ethnic conflict to peace, okay, or conflict to peace. So to achieve peace, we have to slowly but surely manage impunity. So violence refers to everything. No? It could be physical violence, it could be structural violence. No? So imagine ng commission na yung sinasabi ng mga tao na land dispossession is violence, right? Tama naman yan. And therefore, the way to address yung problem ng violence is we have to manage impunity. Alright? Kasi kaya daw nagre-recur yung violence kasi may impunity. Di ba? No one gets punished. Right? No one is held accountable for this violence. Di ba? So how do you then say that we're moving towards peace? We're slowly and surely and systematically addressing violence. How? We're slowly but surely managing impunity. Right? Slowly but surely ensuring that those who commit violence are held accountable for the violence. So, ang framework nila, ito, may slide pa sila dun sa report nila. No? Sabi nila, yung transitional justice mechanism framework nila, nakabatay sa 4 na pillars na universally recognized ng UN. No? These are actually four principles against impunity. No? Now, were first systematized by 2 law professors. No? I think one of them is Swiss. No? Joynet and Oretlicker, right? That's the Joynet and Oretlicker principles no? Against impunity. Yung right to know, right to justice, right to reparation, at saka yung guarantee of non-recurrence. No? If you return to our discussion of conventional transitional justice, this corresponds 1-to-1 dun sa conventional transitional justice mechanism. Right to know refers to truth commissions. Right to justice refers to legal prosecutions. Right to reparation refers to reparation. Tapos yung guarantee of non-recurrence refers to institutional reforms. Okay, so this is a very conventional reading of the the justice mechanisms that is possible supposedly under the transition. Okay. Sige, so just to continue, no? Just to give you a flavor of what kind of findings they arrived at. Una, kunyari, on land dispossession, the commission found that Moros remember, no? Living Moros they interviewed, the 3,000 people, among the 3,000 people they interviewed. Moros remember mass atrocities meant to cleanse, word nila yan, cleanse lands of their original inhabitants to be acquired by corporations and individuals and to be populated by settler communities. Most of these atrocities have yet to be fully documented, formally investigated and addressed. This is just giving you some flavor ng mga findings nila. This is not exhaustive, no? So please Google it, no? You will have a good time reading it. On impunity for human rights violations, again, the TJRC found that it was so serious, the problem was so serious, you can actually talk about the culture of impunity. Okay? Kasi sabi nila, yung impunity daw sa Mindanao, and I think this is also applicable all throughout the Philippines, has to do not only with the failure of the justice system, but also with the political culture, no? Also the politics and the culture, no? And things like the failure of the police and all that. So it's multidimensional, no? And therefore very hard to address overnight. No? It will take a cultural change. For example, it will take political change, no? To be able to really manage impunity. So they know that the task is gargantuan, no? And therefore it will take a lot of things, no? Before we can even begin, no? To address impunity. Okay, doon pa rin. Let's stay on with that. Okay, so I was giving you a flavor of what they found out. Now I'm gonna give you a flavor of some of the recommendations they made before we leave the TJRC and proceed to the rest of the talk. So on land dispossession, the TJRC recommended an overall redesign of land services in the Bangsamoro. Yun yung term nila, no? Which would include changes in the legal framework and all procedures relating to land titling and registration. So actually very ambitious. No? They were saying, if you want to address the problem of land dispossession, we have to reform our land titling system. They even said that as a report. On impunity, the TJRC said they're recommending the establishment of a body, an anti-impunity body, which will investigate, it will identify, it will investigate and recommend
measures, no? And these measures can be anything, no? It could be of a technical character or political or financial. Hindi nila ini-specify what they are, no? So they're imagining a body that will have such tremendous, not only imagination, but also resources, no? And power to really make a dent, no? Sa culture of impunity natin. So yun yung, just to give you a flavor of the recommendations that they're providing. Okay. So let's now proceed to the second part of my talk. So what I did was, I showed you that this is the work of the TJRC, such a great body of work. Please refer to it. Now I'm gonna show you that, okay, may mga limits na yung framework nila. So I will not have time to talk about all of them, no? But I will just point out yung limits ng recommendations nila with respect to land dispossession. So as you will recall, the MILF and the Philippine government thought one of the root causes, one of 4 root causes ng Moro conflict was land dispossession. And it's, ang sabi nila, continuing land dispossession. Okay? And so what I did was, sa next slide na po tayo. I looked to Marawi, no? Kasi Marawi is a case of continuing land dispossession, no? Kasi as you will recall, no? Marawi started as a bunch of people as aligned with supposedly ISIS, no? Occupies the city. The Philippine government's armed forces tried to repel them, no? At first, people thought it'll take a few days, very quick, pero actually it dragged on, no? Became one of the longest running battle, no? Sa history ng Mindanao, no? Tapos people were displaced. Of course, there was fighting, right? Hindi ko na babanggitin yung mga human rights violations na nangyari, no? If you want to consult AI's report on that, no? Amnesty International is very detailed, very clear. But what I want to emphasize here is that after people were displaced by the fighting, and after the fighting actually stopped, and even after Marawi was reconstructed, people still were not able to return, right? Because yung mga inhabitants, no, nung center ng Marawi, no, have been occupying that place without land titles, right? Without registered land titles. So they could not show that they were the owners, no, of their yung plots of land that they wanted to return to. Instead, the government built highways. They build. I read this beautiful blog piece, no, by another friend of ours, no, who si Dalia Simangan, meron siyang ongoing project about documenting places, no, that were important to the Maranaos, no, in Marawi, that were destroyed and were rebuilt, no. So one of the things she points out was that yung Bato Mosque, I hope tama yung naalala kong name na, no? Bato Mosque, yan. You see this is the reconstructed mosque, right? Look at that. Tapos yung minaret, di ba may mga butas-butas pa, na? Tama ba? No, hindi pala yan. Sorry. So this is the reconstructed mosque, and I thought that I think that's the original mosque, yung sira-sira, no? Please correct me if I'm wrong, no? Yung mas familiar sa Marawi, no? They don't look alike, right? So they reconstructed important places na hindi man lang kamukha nung dati. Tapos they also constructed a peace monument supposedly, no? So I think yung minaret na butas-butas, no? Pinreserve nila na butas, parang sa Hiroshima ba? Di ba? Parang siguro iniisip nila, oh, this will remind people of the fighting. But actually, a lot of the Maranaos don't like it, no? Kasi they don't want to be reminded, no, of that fighting, kasi that fighting resulted in their displacement. And in fact, yung park na yon, we didn't used to exist before, na? Now it's there for tourists to reminisce about the conflict, whereas yung mga Moros who will actually displace could not return there kasi park na, di ba? So you get my point, right? So when Marawi was reconstructed, right, Moros, no, at least the Moros who I interviewed, no, thought that this is an example of what we were talking about, no, continuing land dispossession, no, at which lies at the root cause, no, which was one of the root causes of the conflict, no. But if you look at the recommendation in TJRC, there's no way to realize yung justice for those who are displaced in Marawi, because the right to return is not one of those principles na kinonsider sa framework ng dealing with the past, no, right? Okay. How about yung overall redesign of land services, no? Unfortunately, sa Bangsamoro Organic Law, okay, ang sabi doon, no, there is no way to yung land titling system natin, no, hindi natin babaguhin, no. So yung peace agreement, no, approved, no, but it shouldn't result in any land titles being invalidated. In other words, lahat ng mga lupa na sinabi ng mga Moro kinamkam sa kanila since Spanish times pa, right? Na natituluhan, napunta na sa mga korporasyon, sa mga big families, sa mga political dynasties, they're all valid, right? So it is as if we legalize, no, yung crimes, no, na kinumit sa kanila in terms of land dispossession. Okay. So that's what I wanted to say about Marawi, no? So Marawi gives us like a confusing picture, no? Are we really what kind of transition is this, no? And what kind of justice, no, are we trying to achieve during this transition? Sige po, next. Ito, patapos na. So finally, federalism, no? So as I said, when we were conducting interviews, we talked to people, no, different kinds of people. We talked to elite actors, no, people who were involved, no, in the peace process, no, from both the MILF and the MNLF side, people who were in the academe and active in the transitional justice as a professional activity, no, as well as people in the field, no, people like yung mga lumad sa UP, ganyan. Okay. And what we found out was that overwhelmingly, no, some people were critical of federalism, but people in Mindanao actually embraced federalism, no, which was, oh wow, well, what's happening here, no? Tapos, and what we found out was that yung federalism proposal to many people in Mindanao, it was a narrative of justice as well, right? So imagine, transitional justice is a theory of how justice can be achieved during the transition, right? And federalism is also, in a way, a justice narrative, no? Kasi to many Mindanaoans, no? Kunyari, I put a picture here of two of Mindanao's most illustrious politicians, no? Si Nene Pimentel, no?
tsaka si President Duterte, they are both staunch advocates of federalism, no? Uh, uh, Nene Pimentel, no, most of you, I hope, will agree, is a very well-respected politician, a senior politician. Talagang dream niya yan, no? Yung federalism, no? And to him, federalism means, no, freedom from Manila, no? Yeah, di ba? Parang ganyan, eh? So ang narrative ng mga Mindanaoans, no, if we want to achieve justice for Mindanao, if you want to really, ang concept kasi nila ng justice ay as I said, no, economic development, no? If you want economic development for Mindanao, no, you have to decentralize yung resources, no, yung political control, no, from Manila, no? Okay. So but what is missing, no? What is missing in that narrative of justice? What is missing is accountability, di ba? Kasi here, moving forward means let's forget about the past. Let's move on, di ba? Okay. Yung mga move on na discourse na yan, nakakatakot yan, no? Pag di kayo maingat. No? So it largely ignores the need for accountability for past crimes and injustices. So people we interviewed actually said, no, how about yung reparation, no, na nire-recommend ng TJRC? What they said was that, it's not really important, no? Pag yung mga Moro, binigyan mo na ng trabaho, binigyan mo na ng kabuhayan, ay okay na yon kahit hindi na sila bayaran, no, for yung mga nakamkam na lupa sa kanila. Now, that's what they actually told us, no, na yung justice mechanisms ng TJRC to them was less important, no, than moving on, no, creating opportunities for economic development within their region, no. So ang conclusion namin dito, actually federalism stole the show, no, from transitional justice, no. It stole the limelight, no, from transitional justice. No, para silang yung mga tao parang mas na-excite about moving on rather than, and they forgot that justice actually meant, no, also meant, no, importantly, accountability for past atrocities. So it excited many Mindanao and Moro actors as well. As I said, the MLF actors were very excited by this, no, kasi they thought, oh, this is a way to have something like BARM, but for the MNLF, right? Okay. So I'm not gonna dwell on that, kasi konti lang time natin. So in conclusion, so what does it all mean? So I'm saying two things here, no? And maybe this is my chance, not interacting with you. I can revise my conclusion. Maybe it means something more, no? Or something less, no? Depending on, my interaction with you. I hope I'll learn from you. So one thing I was saying in the paper was that the political will to carry out the recommendations of the TJRC is missing. Kasi nga, na-overshadow ng federalism proposal, no? Also, there is more of the same, no? So reflecting on Marawi, no, and martial law in Mindanao, there's more war, right? There's more land grabbing, there's more impunity for human rights violations. So what exactly are we transitioning from, no? Are we transitioning from conflict to peace? Because conflict is still here, right? So that's one set of conclusions to do with what kind of transition are we in. The other set of conclusions has to do with what kind of justice is possible in this transition. As I said, federalism's justice is seductive, but it's flawed, right? So we still need transitional justice, no? So we still need to remember, no, the work of the TJRC and all that. That's why this talk is about underlining the value, no, of what the TJRC did, no? So there's value in the TJRC's work, so we should use it, no? As teachers, no, as students who's trying to educate yourselves about the root causes of the armed conflict. Yeah. But there's also room for improvements. My little contribution. No? So for example, we could still develop the right to return, a very, very relevant, halimbawa, dun sa Marawi example na binigay ko sa study. So yun lang po. Salamat.
Hey, yun. Salamat po, Dr. Jason Lamchek, for your lecture. So definitely, it was so informative and worth pondering. And I'm sure maraming nalalaman at nabuong insights ang mga audience in person at pati na rin sa Zoom. So at this juncture, we will have our reactors from this forum to make their case and provide interpretation. So we'll have three reactors, but first let's have Miss Andrea Faith D. Gazo, President of the UP Mindanao Association of Pre-Law Students, to raise points and embed remarks in her wide-ranging reflections. So, ibibigay ko na yung mic kang Miss Andrea.
Hi, wait, I'll remove my mic. Good morning, everyone. I'm Drea, and I'm the representative of UP Min APLS. And for most, I'd like to thank Sir Lamchek, Dr. Lamchek, for taking the time to share his paper, and also to DSS for giving APLS the opportunity to partner in this event. Okay, so first, actually, I spent the weekend reading Dr. Lamchek's paper because I couldn't trust myself to like take down points from the lecture. I just don't have I have a memory of a goldfish. So ayun, I made some points, and I think it's important to me na ma-mention ko ang positionality ko as a reactor, because I'm a Mindanaoan. I am born and raised in Davao, pero even with that, I'm from Mindanao. I am admittedly not that knowledgeable about the issues in in the Bangsamoro. Although I am aware that there are conflicts, hindi ako na-immerse because ayun nga, I'm from Davao, and I also grew up in a Catholic household. So I don't think na communicate well yung issues sa akin. Pero just recently, I actually developed an interest on legal pluralism. So that pushed me to. So I'm currently reading a lot of stuff about the indigenous peoples and the legal systems in the Bangsamoro. So siguro what I could bring to the table today as a reactor is my insights as a student of anthropology, and also as someone na interested sa legal pluralism and justice. So my first point, sorry, I'm really shaky, this is making me nervous. But my first point that I actually wrote as I finished, oh, actually, shout out to Sammy, because my ideas were actually cleared after I read Dr. Lamchak's paper and after having a conversation with Sammy about it last night. So ayun, yung first first insight ko dito was after reading Dr. Lamchak's paper, I realized just how top-down yung approach to defining justice in the Bangsamoro. So because of this, the way transitional justice is also imagined is also top-down. Ang manifestation nito, I think, is yung kung paano paano na-decide ng Duterte administration, although hindi siya na-realize, paano na-decide ng Duterte administration na ang federal form of government is the best way to achieve healing and justice in the Bangsamoro. And also, on the other hand, yung efforts naman to achieve transitional justice in the Bangsamoro has limitations, and as discussed kanina, and it is also based on international framework of transitional justice. And yun, to add, na-discuss, I think, kanina na, I think ang limitation din dito sa transitional justice is may influence siya ng international donors like the Swiss government. And so, because of that, yung legitimate woes ng Bangsamoro people are not often taken into account, save for that effort ng TJRC to do research on the root causes of the conflict in the Bangsamoro. However, yun nga, na-mention kanina na yung four major root causes, they were simplified into three rubrics kasi ayun, kasi nga, the TJRC based it on a framework na universally accepted, pero I think medyo na-dismiss din yung fact na ang issues ng Bangsamoro are very complex for us to parang use an international framework. And so, if top-down ang approach, there's a failure to examine the structures that perpetuate symbolic and invisible violence towards the people of the Bangsamoro, such as the religious discrimination, the human rights violations, the land dispossession, and the historical injustices that they experienced and continue to experience at present. And this altogether causes the Moro people to be further marginalized. Na-mention ko na kanina, maganda sana yung findings ng TJRC about the root causes of conflict in the Bangsamoro, pero na-simplify siya into impunity, violence, and neglect. Not naman simplify, ayun, pero parang pinilit sa mold na yun. So, yun nga, nakalimutan natin na complex masyado yung issue sa Bangsamoro. And with this, I echo Dr. Lamchek's question sa paper niya na how should we define justice in the Bangsamoro? And I also add, sino ba dapat ang may say kung ano ang injustices sa Bangsamoro, and also sino ang may say kung ano ang tama na steps to achieve justice in the Bangsamoro? Tapos, in connection with marginalization through land dispossession as one root cause of conflict, I'd also like to ask if the pluralistic legal system of the Bangsamoro is to be acknowledged and upheld, would that allow for coming up with an approach to genuine justice that is rooted in the context of Bangsamoro and not solely based on the international framework of transitional justice? And also, sa point ng federalism, ang main talaga na question na nagpasok sa mind ko was, linear ba talaga dapat ang steps natin to justice? Kasi if ganon, federalism, yung the way it's marketed as decentralized ang power, and so ang independent, ang states, ang sub-states, ang sub-regions, they have the liberty to decide on their economic and political endeavors. And ayun, ang isa rin na marketing package ng Duterte administration sa federalism is that we equate it with rapid economic development. And so this reminded me of the Victorian definition of culture and development na linear lang siya. Na there's no way but up. Like we shouldn't look back on our past kasi the only way is forward. And so wait. Although this is not to say naman na hindi okay ang economic development, sino ba naman ang may ayaw ng economic development? Ang akin lang is economic development is only good if it does not alienate the Bangsamoro people. Kasi ngayon, yun nga, na-mention na kanina sa lecture na although the Marawi siege is already done, meron pa ring cases na yung Maranao people, hindi pa sila nakakabalik sa kanilang lands. And ayun, kasi if we take that into account, if we take that into account, siguro economic development cannot be possibly achieved when the issue of land dispossession among the Bangsamoro people is not addressed, because then that would only result in development aggression for the marginalized Bangsamoro people. And also, with that, I realized how taking into account, with this, I realized how demanding accountability from the past atrocities is, by taking history into account, is a significant step to achieve justice in the Bangsamoro. And in general, like achieving justice in general. So this realization reminded me of Paul Farmer's article on the anthropology of structural violence. And I would like to quote my favorite passage from that article na erasing history is perhaps the most common explanatory sleight of hand relied upon by the architects of structural violence. Erasure or distortion of history is part of the process of the socialization necessary for the emergence of hegemonic accounts of what happened and why. And siguro, all in all, from what I rambled, I hope I'm making sense until now, that I'd like to highlight na it's very important to achieve justice. It's okay, it's good to move forward, pero let's not forget siguro that um if we don't address past atrocities, then para sa like, where do we base justice from if we don't look back on the past atrocities na nangyari sa Bangsamoro? And also, for my last point, is just something that I'd like to put out there para naman mapaisip din ng audience. For my last point, after reading the article, one relevant question came to my mind na the question is, what will happen to the Bangsamoro peace efforts in the current political climate and in a government administration that is under the Marcos Duterte tandem, knowing that these surnames are very notorious in denying history. So yun lang po. Thank you.
Salamat, Miss Andrea. So, yun. Ngayon naman, may we have Attorney Marvin Tudes S. De Castro, representative from the Department of Social Sciences, to also make his case and devote his time for this forum as the second reactor. So, sir.
So like any responsible student, I made the PowerPoint while the presenter was giving his lecture, but I'm quite sure we can learn something from here. So allow me to share a PowerPoint presentation of the points that I will be making. So can you see my screen? Yeah. What I'd like to emphasize here, because the speaker initially gave a timeline, a summary of the legal history of the Bangsamoro Organic Law, and what I would like to emphasize is that in general, the attempts to integrate or to address the concerns of the Moro has been met with great resistance. And I would like to emphasize, kasi yung timeline ni Dr. Lamcha kanina started in 2014, but I am a Gloria Arroyo baby, so I would go back as far as 2008. And if you were born by that time, or if you've read the news, you will recall that there was great unrest in Mindanao owing to the fact that the Supreme Court rejected the ancestral domain agreement between the members of the MILF and the national government. And Justice Leonen was still not a member of the Supreme Court at that time. He was still a teacher at the UP College of Law and the chief negotiator for the government. However, good for him, in 2016, he was still already a member of the Supreme Court. Another effort to address the Moro concerns was ultimately taken as constitutional by the Supreme Court. So that's a big victory for the Moro people. And in this case, Justice Leon, and as mentioned earlier, he was a member of the Supreme Court now. So initially, he had to inhibit from the case. There's the assumption that the bar, as the legal entity under the Bangsamoro Organic Law, will carry out transitional justice. But what I would like to emphasize is that as of the moment, there are two cases assailing the constitutionality of the Bangsamoro Organic Law. Meaning to say po, there are still questions on whether or not the Bangsamoro Organic Law and the BARM's existence is legal. There are two possible outcomes to this. Strictly speaking, let's say the law is not unconstitutional. So the law is upheld to be correct. Another outcome, however, would be the law is unconstitutional and that the BARM's existence might be declared null and void. If this were to be the case, what entity will carry forward the idea of transitional justice? Or will we be going back to the old ways wherein we have to scrap down the entire bar. It's uncertain as of the moment because, again, the Supreme Court has yet to categorically rule on the matter. But as we think about moving forward, I would like to emphasize, do we have the vehicle in the first place? Because, again, the constitutionality of the Bangsamoro Organic Law has yet to be categorically ruled upon by the Supreme Court. And you might recall, I mentioned earlier in the lecture that one of the components is the integration into the ordinary life, but I would like to emphasize that there has been trouble with this integration aspect, meaning in particular, the combatants of the MILF have yet to be fully decommissioned. People are still holding on to their guns, so to speak. And if the constitutionality of the Bangsamoro Organic Law still hangs in the balance, I would say that on the part of them, maybe there's wisdom in holding on or being hesitant, or this decommissioning process is one of the factors in the slow decommissioning process is this uncertainty over the Bangsamoro Organic Law. Okay, that's what I mentioned earlier. Another point would be the Lumad agenda. Of course, we're familiar with the categorization of Mindanao as a tri-people society. You have the migrant settlers, you have the indigenous peoples, and you have the Moro. In general, we can call them we have this category called the marginalized sectors. What are marginalized sectors? Literally speaking, that's what they are. They're marginalized in the sense that opportunities for them are limited, and in a way, there is a systemic discrimination against them. And the Constitution makes an enumeration of marginalized sectors. You have people from the labor sector, peasant, urban poor, indigenous cultural communities, and so on. And these marginalized sectors, one of the key elements of the 1987 Constitution has been to acknowledge their problems. And that's why we have the party list system acknowledging them. That's why you have, let's say, Kabataan party list to acknowledge the youth sector. You also had Manaktawis before and Katribo to address the indigenous cultural communities. However, we look at the last portion of the provision, except the religious sector. And it might be worth noting that the Bangsamoro adheres itself to Islamic faith. So by this definition, people would be asking themselves, would they consider, legally speaking, not in the social sense, as the Bangsamoro as being a marginalized sector? This is important because if you look at, again, the marginalized sectors, we have a law for each. For farmers, you have the CARP law, the Comprehensive Agrarian Reform Program. For the indigenous peoples, you have the IPRA, or the Indigenous Peoples' Rights Act. For the Moro, you have the Bangsamoro Organic Law. The problem here is, if a parcel of land is simultaneously claimed by a peasant, a Lumad, and a Moro, what law will govern? Between three laws addressing three marginalized communities, how do we properly frame the problem? Is there a ranking system where we give primacy from one sector to another? Do we have a uniform system for recognizing land rights? Kasi kung magkaiba yung way of recognizing land ownership sa CARP, iba yung land recognition process for IPRA, iba yung mechanism for addressing the land dispossession under the Bangsamoro Organic Law, how do we move forward, kumbaga, na not just in the Bangsamoro sense, but as Mindanao, na may farmers, indigenous peoples, and the Moro people. If you do a control F of the law, Bangsamoro Organic Law, and you look for indigenous peoples, there are general provisions including them in the law. And I think that should be lauded, that should be recognized. My question, however, is operationally speaking, implementing it wise, how does this happen? Again, you go back to this question. Does the law carry any provision addressing this? I'm not sure if I missed it, but if there's any, I would be willing to be enlightened on the matter. Dr. Lamchek earlier mentioned that one of the weaknesses of the law is that the failure to expropriate lands, or there is no revocation of existing titles. And I think some of my students here from Econ Antro are well enough familiar with the idea of eminent domain. Eminent domain in the simplest sense is the government takes away private property and uses it for a public purpose. Let's say in the build, let's say someone's home is close to the street and the street has to be expanded. So the government will just pay the landowner a big sum of money so they can get the land and use it for making the street. Under the CARP, may ganun po tayong, sa CARP po, may ganun pong provision. There's a provision of law for CARP granting the government the right to expropriate for purposes of agrarian reform for the peasants. In IPRA, the same is possible as well. May budget po yung government to expropriate land for indigenous peoples. Although, meron pong kumbaga reverse uno card, the government can expropriate indigenous people's lands as well. So parang, it's a big question mark. Is it really a recognition of the right of the LUMAD, the IPRA law, if by the end of the day, the government can just step in and expropriate their lands once more? So parang nag-reverse uno card lang tayo dito when we talk about IPRA. Still, there's the recognition here. But then again, I would say this particular provision, the reverse uno card in terms of expropriation, is a bit problematic. As Dr. Lamchak said earlier, there will be no revocation of existing titles. No, sorry. No revocation of existing titles for the Bangsamoro organic law. And I think that would be reverse expropriation in other words. As he said in the Marawi case, diba, there will no longer be a return of the people to Marawi. Instead, they will be given just compensation. Kung ako lang, that's a shortcut for eminent domain purposes. I mean, if that's the case, anyone will just stage a war somewhere, then claim that people can no longer return, and they will just be compensated for their parcel of land, and that's the end of it. So kung ako lang, I echo Dr. Lamchek's idea about the cancellation of titles. It's a bit problematic, but at the same time, I think the bigger question would be, how do we move forward, not just as the Bangsamoro, but also as Mindanao, bearing in mind that, again, we are a tri-people island. So that ends my talk. Thank you.
Thank you, sir, for that insightful reaction. As our last reactor, may we also have Maria Victoria Mags Maglana, a peace advocate, to raise points and provide a useful shift of perspective with regards to the forum.
Ayong buntag sa atong tanan. And assalamualaikum. Hello po, Dr. Jason. 2023 marks the 7th year since the TJRC report was launched in 2016. It is imperative that we do a comprehensive stock taking on the 7th year, and this work by Dr. Jason Lamchek is a significant contribution to the effort. I want to commend the UP Mindanao Department of Social Studies with special mention kay Kurt Tandog in organizing this activity and by bringing in the faculty and students, thereby involving more views and voices. It's also my privilege to join Andrea and Attorney Marvin. Unlike Attorney Marvin, I wasn't bright enough to come up with a PowerPoint presentation, so magkwentuhan na lang tayo. Sige. I want to share that aside from the lecture just shared by Dr. Jason, I will also refer heavily to the paper mentioned by Andrea. Pareho kaming natakot kaya nagbasa din ako. I assume that many of the points of the paper, I think, na-raise din naman sa lecture ni Dr. Jason. Right off, I will express my agreement with one of the conclusions of Dr. Lamchek in the paper. Sabi niya kasi, and I will quote, "The Philippines highlights the importance of further developing the discourse of transitional justice to move beyond its current paradigmatic approaches and into a direction that is more nuanced, flexible, and responsive to local conditions." I agree 110%. And Dr. Lamchek will be pleased to note that there have been initiatives to unpack, adapt, localize, contextualize, and even move beyond the 4 pillars of conventional transitional justice and the dealing with the past that is associated with Swiss peace. No? For the moment, let me just point to the work of the Initiatives for International Dialogue, or IID. They did, among others, a study that explored justice and transitional justice through Mindanaoan lenses. I think the Antro people in the room will be pleased na refreshing and grounding to learn, no? Na yung mga Taduray, meron silang ketanak, which I think is their the word for justice, no? And also kefeyo fedo, which refers to peace of mind and right spirit, felt both individually and collectively through the full restoration of relationships between and among conflicting parties. Definitely not a very conventional way of defining justice. As a caveat, I do want to issue a disclaimer that I am not here to defend the TJRC report because I am not in the position to do so. But also, as full disclaimer, I was involved in the writing of the report, no? Both in the preparation of the historical injustice report and in the finalization of the TJRC report itself. No? However, in keeping with the right to know and the exercise of academic freedom, there are some points of curiosity that I would like to raise in this forum, addressing some of the points raised by Dr. Jason. The first point of curiosity that I have is that in the lecture and in the paper, there is constant reference to root causes and associating the root causes with the four. If you've been listening to Dr. Jason, ano yung four na sinasabi niya? Aber? Nasabi niya ay tinakol ng TJRC. Yes, ma'am. Meron. Okay lang, walang maling sagot. Land, yes. Land marginalization through land dispossession is one of the four. Ano pa ba? Yes po. That's right. Historical injustice. Meron pa? Human rights violations. Meron pa isa. Reparation is one of the pillars, no? Meron pa isa. Yes po. That's right. Galing, no? So nakinig kayo. So itong apat, oo, ito talaga yung mandato ng TJRC. No? Ang mandate ng TJRC ay aralin ang mga apat na to at magbigay ng rekomendasyon, including mechanisms. Pero nagulat lang ako kasi when I checked the TJRC report itself, it does not refer to the four as the root causes. And even the annex on normalization lists the four, but does not call them root causes. And even the TJRC terms of reference, also, they list the four, but they are not referred to as the root causes. So ang argument ko, and this is the point of inquiry, sa tingin ko, baka kailangan basahin yung full quote ng TJRC report. Kasi ang sabi ng full quote sa TJRC report ay, based on the findings of the consultation process na dinescribe ni Dr. Jason, the TJRC produced its own analysis of the issues related to its mandate and of the root causes of the current conflict. Kasi ang full analysis niya ng root causes ng conflict, sa totoo lang, the first time I read it, blew my mind away. Kasi ito yung full quote eh. Moreover, the TJRC came to the conclusion that these issues, and the issues are the four, sinabi nyo, no, are the result of three interlocking phenomena. At tama si Dr. Jason na binanggit yung violence, impunity, and neglect. But it does not stop there. It says, which in turn are rooted in the imposition of a monolithic Filipino identity and Philippine state by force on multiple ethnic groups in Mindanao and the Sulu archipelago that saw themselves as already pre-existing nations and nation states, unquote. That's the full analysis. So sa TJRC report, hindi niya sinasabing root cause yung apat. Sa tingin niya, issues lang yun. At yes, binanggit niya yung tatlo, pero mas inugat niya uli dun sa yun yung reading about yung imposition of a monolithic Filipino identity and Philippine state by force, which I think is more grounded and more anchored on the aspirations for right to self-determination of the Bangsamoro. And even other indigenous groups. Kaya ko sinabing it blew my mind away kasi this quotation is one of a few in reports, no? Kung baka nga ito lang commissioned by government and another party and accepted by government and another party that acknowledges the reality of colonization, yes, of the Philippines, but more importantly sa Mindanao. Kasi, di ba, ito naman yung sinasabi ng mga Mindanaoan, oo, lahat ng what we know now as the Philippines and as Filipinos, tinamaan tayo ng kolonyalismo, no? Pero kakaiba ang epekto sa Mindanao. Kasi nadamay lang tayo di ba? Kung babalik ka talaga sa kasaysayan, kung hindi na ibenta ang Pilipinas sa Amerikano, ano nga bang paano nga tayo binenta? Kalimutan nyo na. Ano yung magkano tayo binenta at ano yung transaksyon? $20 million? Tama, no? At ano nga ba yung anong kasunduan yon? No, the Treaty of Paris, no? Kung hindi dahil doon, hindi naman kasama ang Mindanao, di ba? Kasi technically hindi sinakop ng ang Spaniards, ang Spanish colonial government, ang Mindanao. Only select coastal areas. Alam natin kung saan. Davao Oriental facing the Pacific, Cotabato, Zamboanga, and then a part of northern Mindanao, no, or northeastern Mindanao. But the interiors, definitely not. Kailan lang pinasok ang Davao City? One of the last na pinasok ng mga Spanish forces ang Davao City. So, yun na nga, ang point lang doon, yun, in-acknowledge yun, no, ng TJRC report, which I think is really more nuanced compared to the other analysis that I've read. No, so, doon lang ako, yan nga, point of curiosity, saan nanggagaling yung root causes itong apat? Kasi wala siya sa TJRC report, hindi ganun yung framing ng TJRC report. At yung apat ay hindi pa pinangalanan ng Annex on Normalization and the TJRC TOR as the root causes. In fact, kwento ko lang sa inyo, hirap na hirap kami paano ipaliwanag yung apat. Kasi wala siyang title Ano ba to? Issues, problems. Kaya pag kinukwento namin yan, sasabi lang namin yung apat na mandato, ganun na lang. Kasi wala siyang categorization. No? So yun yung aking point of inquiry. No? Now, so just to wrap that up, my own view is that the TJRC started with the 4 issues or problems that it was mandated to study, but it came around to articulating a more grounded analysis that connects to the struggles of the Bangsamoro and other non-Bangsamoro in Mindanao. So is it the analysis when it comes to the Bangsamoro? I don't think so. I've always figured that analysis keeps on growing and we're waiting for the next report, the next piece, the next study that will provide a better articulation and explanation of how we came to be, no? Parang ganun. Naintindihan ko yung critique ni Dr. Jason on conventional TJ, lalo na yung presentation that says yung legalist, no, yung focuses on individual civil and political rights violations. In fact, tama, isa yon sa mga discomfort ng maraming TJ advocates. Kasi nga, sometimes, pag sinabing justice, akala korte ka agad. Kaya nga, maraming nagsasabi, mas gusto nila yung DWP kasi mas broad, no? Pero minsan, wala ding precision masyado. In any case, matutuwa si Dr. Jason na among the communities involved in transitional justice and dealing with the past in the Philippines, human rights goes beyond civil and political rights. And we're very clear in saying it encompasses economic, social, and cultural rights. No? So not just the individual rights, but definitely the collective rights. When I say community, I refer to the independent working group, IWG, Transitional Justice Dealing with the Past, tsaka yung Transitional Justice League. Disclosure, I'm also part of both groups, and yung IWG ay ito yung mga individuals na mas na-involved sa pag-prepare ng TJRC report, no? Tsaka yung listening process as an aspect of the report. Yung Transitional Justice League is a group that's also that works very closely with the Commission on Human Rights, no? Kasi ang CHR meron din silang initiatives on transitional justice. Second point of curiosity ko ay hindi, third point of curiosity, second na pala yung ano. Third point of curiosity ko ay yung sabi ni description ni Dr. Jason sa kanyang dun sa paper, and I think binanggit din niya, no? Description na, quote, thus the TJRC recommended a familiar package of legal, political, and institutional reforms that is assumed to be capable of being carried out by the Philippine government, unquote. Marami ang medyo may discomfort sa kinds of recommendations. Advocates would describe the sets of recommendations in two ways, no? Sabi nila, what needs to be created, and that is the NTJRCB, the National Transitional Justice and Reconciliation Commission, the Bangsamoro, and what can already be implemented, referring to the 90 plus or even 99 specific recommendations that are parang ang treatment ay doable sa to at pwede nang ipatupad ng gobyerno, no? National government and regional government and other stakeholders. Pero where are we now? Legitimate question. At kung merong gagawa ng comprehensive analysis nga or assessment na overdue, I'd say kakaunti pa lang ang napatupad. And so sa akin sometimes sinisip ko, is it the inadequacy of the recommendations? Kasi malinaw naman yung framing niya eh. Ang framing niya, ito yung kailangan i-create para makapagpursige pa. Tsaka ito yung mga pwede nang ipatupad, no? Ganun. So hindi ko alam kung the inadequacy of the recommendations or the glaring inadequacy of implementation of the recommendations. If you ask government, they will say, may ginawa na naman kami meron kaming roadmap. So yung una nag-create sila ng mechanism, the ICCMN Inter-Cabinet Cluster Committee on Normalization, no? Inter-Cabinet Cluster Mechanism on Normalization, ICCMN, na gumawa ng roadmap, no, on transitional justice based on the TJRC report. Meron naman ganon. Meron din pa konti-konti. Pero, diba, in light of what needs to be addressed, in light of the long list of recommendations, kakaunti lang talaga ang napatupad, no? Now, kaya tama yung yung dissatisfaction. Kulang. Pero hindi ibig sabihin na dahil kulang, therefore palpak yung report. Baka kailangan balikan at i-recast siya from a better perspective, no? Yan. Yung pang-apat na yata to. Pang-apat ko na point of curiosity ay yung pagsaklaw ng Marawi. Kasi tama, walang legitimate and comprehensive discourse on transitional justice in the Philippines kung hindi sasaklawin ng Marawi. Because if you remember, it broke out in May 2017 and was liberated, quote unquote, and with a lot of sarcasm, October 2017, after 5 months, no? Ang point ko lang, parang mahirap igamitin yung Marawi, ang nangyari sa Marawi as a case against the TJRC report. Because sa totoo lang, hindi nga napatupad eh. Natapos yung report na launch 2016, shortly before the end of the Aquino administration. Tapos nag-transition na kaagad kay President Duterte na nag-declare kaagad ng giyera 1 year later. So parang my argument is that the Marawi crisis is actually proof of the importance of transitional justice, rather than an indication na hindi sapat. Kasi hindi talaga siya napatupad by the time Marawi happened. Now, meron ng Marawi Siege Victims Compensation Act of 2022 or RA 11696, which is a reparations measure, pero sa totoo lang hindi yan sapat, no? There are many things that need to be done to afford justice and redress for the victims of the Marawi crisis. By the way, I'm deliberately staying away from the word siege kasi kung kausap mo din yung ibang mga Maranao, medyo problematic sa kanila yung word na siege. Kasi sasabi nila, who initiated the siege? Was it the Dawla Islamiyah or was it the Philippine military? So may nagsabi sa akin, baka crisis na lang para a little more. No? Anyways, so contested din, no? Although the law does say siege. And as we know, other than the Marawi crisis and the realities of violent extremism in many parts of not just BARM, but Mindanao. Ang other challenges natin in terms of violence, yung horizontal violence in the BARM, meron pa rin rido, no? Maraming rido. No? At yung horizontal violence affecting the Bangsamoro outside the BARM. No? So yun nga yung tanong namin eh. Itong mga ito, maraming injustice na nagbinunga. So anong mekanismo ang tutugon? Kung TJRCB, ang limitation ay nakapako siya sa peace process. So kung akong tatanungin, ang limitasyon ng current conceptualization ng mechanism ng transitional justice ay pinako siya sa peace agreement. Napakalinaw ng saklaw ng peace agreement. Yung kanyang two tracks, no? The political track and the normalization track. Kaya sana sana mainat, no? Para ma-include yung for example, another example of horizontal violence ngayon sa many areas, yung violence against indigenous peoples na I think binanggit din ni Attorney Marvin, no? So sana yung batas, kung may batas mang ipapasa tungkol sa mechanisms on transitional justice and reconciliation, sana hindi lang sa BARM. No? Kung pang Bangsamoro yan, hindi lang yan BARM. No? It will have to include other areas where the Bangsamoro are. Yung last three, sa tingin ko, federalism. Sa tingin ko, in the context of the Philippines, lalo na nitong past elections, federalism is a proposed solution that unfortunately was co-opted by a set of political actors na naghahanap ng convenient agenda na magagamit nila to rally support for their electoral aspirations. And once they got what they wanted, which was seats in government, they abandoned federalism. Because totoo naman by 2020, wala nang diskurso tungkol sa federalism na matino coming from government. I could be mistaken about the year, but I think we can say nag-fizzle out siya talaga. So I'm not prepared to concede that federalism is parang competition ng transitional justice. My view is that federalism is not a competing solution. It's not a competing solution to TJR, but it's another aspect of the many transformations that are required dito sa Mindanao at sa buong bansa. Kasi, last 2 points ko, TJ is not a magic solution. It does not and cannot resolve many of the ills of a society that is transitioning. And I like to quote Pablo de Graef, the former special rapporteur on truth, justice, and reparation. He says, quote, "Transitional justice is not meant to take people to heaven. It is meant to take them out of hell." And what is that hell? That's the hell of human rights violations. But it cannot, in itself or by itself, transform society. That's why it has to work alongside other frameworks, other paradigms, other movements. Kaya sa akin mahalaga yung paalala ni Mo Bleeker kung kailan lang practical na i-apply ang TJ. Kasi hindi siya pwedeng gamitin sa lahat ng context. Sabi nila Mo Bleeker, pwede siya sa situations where you have massive violations of human rights, and then they say civil, political, social, economic, and cultural, and international humanitarian laws na nava-violate, no? And it can probably happen where you have internal armed conflicts and or authoritarian regimes, and where there's a proximity between victims and perpetrators. And they also acknowledge that in these things often happen in a situation where you have a weak or fragile state, where there's unequal development, where there's corruption, where there's criminality. Pero yung context na yon, yung apat na last na binanggit ko, hindi yun necessarily lang sinusuportahan ng TJ. Kasi ang dapat lang talaga i-address ng TJ ay yung massive human rights violations. And then it has to work with the other solutions nga sana, no? So kung sasagutin ko yung tanong, no, very provocative question, title of this forum, should you deal with the past or move forward? Ang sagot ko ay, ¿por qué no los dos? Which means, why not both? Because you need to deal with the past, and we do need to move forward, no? So allow me to close by reading from Dr. Lamchek's paper, quote, overcoming the past may not happen in a linear or predictable manner. Not only can accountability be slow to achieve, but transitions can be interrupted. Further, justice may demand a more dramatic break from the past than what political institutional remedies currently offer, unquote. And I want to use that quotation as an invitation to everyone present here physically and to those who are also online, particularly the students and faculty of UP Mindanao, to be involved in developing, applying, evolving transitional justice frameworks and measures that are truly serving, no, that will serve, no, the interest of Mindanaoans and Filipinos. So kana lang, daghang salamat, maayong buntag.
Thank you so much, Mags, for raising points and providing fresh perspectives and information. I know na we also come up with the same sentiments too. So kaya naman, at this time, I know that we can help make difference the moment that we enter here. So kaya sa pagkakataong ito, let's go ahead and take time for an open forum to be facilitated by instructor Malaya Lapinya.
Ayan, so muli maraming salamat Dr. Jason Lamchak for that discussion about transitional justice in Mindanao, specifically in Bangsamoro. And to our reactors, Andrea, Attorney Dudes, and Bags, no, for giving us a new perspective on how to tackle the topic that was discussed by Dr. Jason a while ago. So before siguro tayo ang magbasa ng mga questions sa Zoom, sa ating mga online participants, may mga questions ba from the audience na or mga hindi masyadong malinaw or naguguluhan pa ng mga points na na-raise kanina ng both ni Dr. Lamchak at yung ating mga reactors. Yeah, si Sir Romel.
Hi all. Romel faculty. Yung ano lang, yung tumatak sa akin at sa last yung about mention ni Jason na the political will to carry out the recommendations of the TGRC is missing, no? So if it if those politic if that some if those like, political wills or political how does it initiatives to carry out the recommendations so nun sa TGRC should be there, how it should look like or how it should like be stated.
Yeah, actually, yung mga observers from abroad, no? Yung mga nagsusulat about transitional justice ng mga scholars, they're confused about what's happening in the Philippines. No? So officially, dahil sa peace agreement, we are in a transition. No? As I said, may Transitional Justice and Reconciliation Commission, may mga recommendations sila how to carry out justice during this transition. Pero some people will say, because the political will is missing, right, to really, carry out yung recommendations ng commission, maybe we should think of the transition as interrupted. No? We don't really have a transition, no? Right now. Even though na-conclude na yung peace process, and even though may mga clear set of recommendations, sabi nga ni Mags, no? Meron naman tayong roadmap and all that, pero in reality, kokonti lang na-achieve. No? Nobody has yet done a systematic assessment, pero my feeling is that the transition is suspended, no? Until we have a government that is clearly committed, no, to ensuring na yung mga justice issues, as I said, that couldn't be addressed before will be addressed. So it's as if we're still there in the past, no, na we couldn't quite address this justice concern. So yung Marawi, as I said, no, sabi ko, yung Marawi is a very clear illustration to me. It's very clear, no? ang ganda-ganda no analysis ng TJRC, no? They really get it, no? What does it mean, no? Na yung land dispossession is a very important aspect of why we have this conflict, no? Pero even if we follow yung recommendation ng TJRC, we won't solve this problem kasi until we develop the right to return, and I think that's key to how to solve the Marawi, yung mga na-display sa Marawi, then we can't really say we're giving justice to these people.
Thank you, Sir Romel and Dr. Jason. Sige, bago po natin basahin yung question ni Dr. Joanna Lynn Cruz from Department of Humanities, I would like also to ask something po in regards with the points raised by Attorney Adudes and Mags about the issue of minoritization in Mindanao, specifically in Bangsamoro, in connection with the Lumad. No? My question is, kinakailangan paano kaya haharapin or kinakailangan bang harapin muna ng Bangsamoro yung mga injustices na nagawa nito towards the lumad na sakop ng Bangsamoro homeland? Yun po. Para in connection doon sa tinatawag natin transitional justice between the Bangsamoro and the Filipino government.
Parang binabalik mo yung question ko sa sarili ko, na. So yung contribution ko is to ask the question, to show that there is a question, no? Kasi so ang pinapakita ko ay yung situation sa Mindanao, particularly sa Bangsamoro ay, so on the one hand, no, the government and the MLF seems to say, because they created this TJRC, which made this framework na ang tawag nila dealing with the past, is that they seem to say we should deal with the past, right? Among other things that we should do, we should deal with the past to you know, to have some change, no, sa kasalukuyan. At the same time, we know that during the 30th time, and I don't know kung under BBM then, the government very aggressively promoted federalism and excited a lot of people. And it seems na ang concern nila is to move forward without really dealing with the past, right? So ang sasabi ko, in Mindanao, people seem to have, you know, there seem to be two ways, no, two views, no? Tapos yung those who think that we should deal with the past seems to be marginalized, no, by people who seem to think that justice means moving forward, no. If you ask me, I would have the same view as Mags, no, na why not do both, right? In fact, we should do both. In fact, the fact that people are excited, no, by the thought that we should have, you know, we should have more opportunities for people for economic development and all that. That indicates to me an energy that TJ people have not tapped into, right? It indicates to me that maybe the TJ people, no, they're saying something very important, but it did not quite, no, tag dito, resonate, no, with people under. Mas na-capture pa na imagination yung moving forward paradigm, no? And I think that's such a sad thing, no? Just because a lot of people are excited by it doesn't mean it's right. Right? In fact, I'm criticizing both, no? So I'm saying dealing with the past, that's good, no? But don't forget about things like the right to return, right? Yung new ideas about how to achieve justice in very complicated situations such as Mindanao. At the same time, I'm also criticizing this energy, no, with federalism moving on, because if you just move on without making people accountable, no, for past atrocities, are you really sure you're moving on, no? Or are you repeating the mistakes of the past, no? So personally, no, I prefer doing both, no, at the same time, no. I'm not saying we should go on with federalism. I'm just saying there is a justice narrative behind federalism which TJ people can learn from, no, I think.
Thank you, Dr. Jason. So, Ma'am Joanna has a question. I think it's not a question, but there are Moro or Maranao representations in the room who can give some insights to the topic discussed by Dr. Lamchak. Sadly mukhang wala no sa room na ito. So may mga questions pa ba mula sa ating audience? Ay, sige. Ay, ayun.
Sa tingin ko, kailangan ng malaking tulong ng advocates of transitional justice and federalism. Tulong mula sa inyo para mas maipaliwanag ng mas maayos yung transitional justice, no? Kasi tulad ngayon, kapag sinabi mong transitional justice, iniisip ka agad Bangsamoro, no? Or peace process. Pero meron ding dapat transitional justice para sa mga katutubo, no? Sa mga lumad in particular. Dapat kinahanglan sad og transitional justice katong mga victims ng extrajudicial killings, no? So daghang paglapat dapat or pag-apply ng transitional justice. Ang medyo prominent lang ngayon kasi nga may batas no? Yung BOL may provisions sa transitional justice, pero sabi nga ni Attorney Marvin, medyo merong dalawang challenge na naka-lodge. So, paano ba natin ma-communicate ng maayos yung transitional justice as a framework, no? And different measures na pwedeng ilapat sa iba't ibang sitwasyon. And dito, naalala ko din yung sinabi ni Jonathan Sison. Ang Sison niya ay double SS, wala siyang kinalaman kay Jose Maria. Ang sabi ni Jonathan Sison, transitional justice is not a technical solution. You always go back to the problem that you are addressing. Kaya kailangan bumalik ka dun sa pagsusuri. Ano ba yung problema? Ano ba yung malawakang paglabag ng karapatang pantao na nilulutas natin? No? So yun, kailangan bumalik. So I guess, again, I'm appealing to you, people in the room here, physically present, virtually, to expand the conversation, to find the right images and words that will make it resonate. Kasi mahalaga siya sa buhay ng mga tao pang araw-araw, hindi lang natin siya nako-connect kaagad. No, so yun yung ano. Tapos one last point lang po. Kung makikinig po yung from hindi lang MILF even other peace advocates. Technically po, tapos na yung Bangsamoro peace talks, pero yung peace process ay hindi pa po. Kasi nga pinapatupad pa yung political track tsaka yung normalization track. Matatapos lang yan kapag pumirma ng isang agreement sa dulo, yung end agreement. At may preconditions bago umabot doon. So, tuloy-tuloy pa po yung peace process, kung tutusin. Tapos na yung talks, but the process is still ongoing. Thank you.
Thank you, Mad. So, may mga reaction ba or questions from the audience? Kurt.
Hello, good morning sa lahat. So hindi siguro to question just like only para kay Sir Jason. Hello, okay na. So hindi itong question I think is not reserved only for Dr. Jason Lamshek but for every one of us. Kung mukhang confusing at magulo yung transitional justice sa BARM and also transitional justice in other places, how do we place and tackle other issues like climate change and environmental degradation na mahalaga rin sa panahong ito? And in my perspective, ngayon sa BARM, magkakaroon ng buhos ng pera sa climate change. Pero nung nag-discussion sa mga stakeholders, ang questions nila, anong climate change na yan? Eh meron pa kaming standing problems ng conflict, poverty, hindi kami makauwi sa mga bahay namin. Pero climate change is there. It's already happening to us. So paano natin i-insert yung ganong mga klaseng iba pang issues na sobrang complicated nung nangyayari? So ganon. Salamat.
Thank you, Kurt. So tama no yung point ni Kurt na hindi lang naman iisa yung issue tapos stand alone lang siya na issue, no? Parang may intersection, no? Connect ang mga isyung ito lalo na sa Mindanao, specifically sa Bangsamoro. Sino pang may mga reactions or questions? Mga antro students na into Mindanao studies, no? Meron bang mga questions or reactions no, doon sa Yeah, parang wala nang question sa chat. Siguro dahil gutom na yung mga tao. Sige, akong wala nang question. Again, thank you. Maraming salamat kay Dr. Jason and Mags, Attorney Dudes, and kay Andrea for the reactions. And sa mga nag-raise din ng questions. Thank you.
Salamat, Instructor Malaya, sa pag-facilitate sa open forum. So ngayon naman ay ang awarding ng certificate. So may request Department Chair Sir Janus Cavazares and Kurt Tandog to come here and do the honor. So So let me read the citation first. College of Humanities and Social Sciences, University of the Philippines, Mindanao. This certificate of appreciation is hereby presented to Dr. Jason S. Lamchek as an acknowledgement for his invaluable contribution as a resource person in the forum discussion on transitional justice in the Bangsamoro and Federalism. Should we deal with the past or move forward? Given this 5th day of June 2023 at the Lorenzo Hall Administration Building, University of the Philippines, Mindanao, Mintal, Togbuk District, Davao City. So, picture. Yeah. So, ngayon is that let's have closing remarks to be given to us by our department chair, Prof. Janus Rovelti Cabzares.
Hello, good morning sa lahat. Bago tayo magtapos, gusto ko lang pasalamatan yung mga taong malaki ang ginawa para ma-raise at masimulan o magawa itong discussion na ito kay Dr. Lamchek. Maraming salamat for presenting your research dito sa UP Mindanao. Napakalayo, galing pa ng Australia. At saka kay Kurt for organizing yung activity, sa Association of Pre-Law Students for helping organize the activity, at yung sa Department of Social Sciences kay Attorney Dudes, at also kay Mags, maraming salamat for being a reactor. And then hopefully kasi isang malaking very important point talaga na na-raise doon sa lecture ay yung pagpatuloy nung discussion o pag-argue ng points, to look at yung nuances, and then hopefully this will continue, hindi lang dito na venue. And gusto kong mag-plug na sa next sem, may subject kami na legal and political anthropology na I think will be a very good opportunity to continue yung mga themes na na-raise dito na discussion, and hopefully ituturo ni Attorney Dudes. Okay, so maraming salamat, and then have a good day. Thank you.
Okay, so that's it for today, everyone. So we appreciate you being here. So again, we'd like to acknowledge your presence, both in person and through Zoom. Again, let's give a big a hand for our speaker, Dr. Jason Aslamchek, to our to our reactors, Miss Andrea, Attorney Dudes, Mags, facilitator, Malaya, sa lahat ng nag-facilitate nito, APLS, sa lahat. So let's give a round of applause to everyone. So, may evaluation form na ibibigay. Paki-fill up na lang po. Okay, so ngayon ay magkakaroon tayo ng photo op. So requesting lahat na pumunta sa front para mag-picture. Okay na ba? So, everyone, punta tayo here para mag-photo op.
Thank you sa tanan. Hope to see you sa uban pa na seminars in the future or forum discussion.